between the two, you would have a continuum of various bizarre-looking cars and bizarre-looking pickup trucks. That wouldn't have changed in any way the fact that cars exist and pickup trucks exist.
I want to kind of respond to the first thing that he said, which was the existence of race in general. So, Jeff, I just want to make sure that this is your argument. So your argument is that when you have a person with a certain trait, let's say that we have like 3 different societies on Earth living in different locations, one of which with, this is purely fictional, but one of which with red skin, one of which with blue skin, and one of which with green skin. And let's say that there are other qualities to these people that make them different from one another. If those red people had kids that were also red, and vice versa for every other society, that would affirm the, I don't know, the existence of races within that particular species.
Absolutely. That would be sufficient for me to use the word race.
Okay. So I don't necessarily think that this is really relevant to the discussion here. I do, in fact, believe that there is diversity among humans. I don't think that is something that you could ever like refute. Obviously, people are different from one another. There is an immense array of genetic diversity on the planet. The question is not, is there diversity? The question is, how do we classify this diversity, right? Now, the fact that someone is going to have a kid that looks like them is just a fact of genetics. We know this from high school biology class when we learn about like Mendelian genetics. You know that 50% of your DNA for any particular trait is going to be passed on to your kid. And normally, your kid is going to look like a combination of you and whoever you're decided to have the kid with. Now, obviously, that is true. That's not deniable in any way, shape, or form. The fact is the differences between my kid and another kid, is that able to be distinguished? Is there a distinction between those differences? And even then, when we look at a broad societal level, when we classify everyone's genetic diversity, are those things distinct enough to be classified into races? That is the question here. When we look at, you were talking about the definitions of race, there are many meanings of race. Like you have social definitions of race that come along with, you know, the philosophers of like the 19th century. You have like biological definitions of race, which came from things like early science, early biological science, and early taxonomy. And then, you know, you have a bunch of different definitions of race. The one that I want to go off of, and I think this is generally like a decent one, and I think you kind of you provided a definition that was pretty similar to this, which is the idea that you know, human species can be divided into distinct groups based on the basis of inherited physical or behavioral differences, which I think we can both agree on, right? Now, I would say that the diversity throughout the entire human species is not necessarily able to be divided in such a way. There are not distinct groups based on physical differences. Every physical difference in humankind can be classified along a spectrum. And because of that, we cannot provide any kind of distinction between one group and another regarding any kind of like ancestry. That's one part of the discussion. I don't want to gish gallop you, obviously. We can focus on one, but you started talking about stuff like 23andMe. That is not really applicable to this context, since I believe, I'm not too familiar with how they do their genetic analysis, but the one way that they use genetic analysis, especially for like ancestry, is through mitochondrial. Oh my God, how did I forget this? Sorry, it's the Y-DNA samples that you get from the mitochondria. My mitochondrial Y-DNA.
No,
so,
that is the Y chromosome is paternal, mitochondria is maternal.
Yeah. So it's the maternal DNA, right? So
no, 23andMe does. 23andMe, I've been scanning my own genes with it.
Sure.
They do a complete autosomal scan that includes all parts of the genome, including the non-maternal and non-paternal ones.
Yeah, no, I know that, but I'm specifically talking about the ancestry portion of 23andMe, which is, I believe, only using the maternal mitochondria. How do I forget this? There's the maternal DNA that's being passed on from mother to son to whatever. That is how they classify haplogroups normally, and those haplogroups are the ones that are being used for ancestry. And that's why I don't think it's applicable, because that maternal DNA isn't really like that important when discussing differences, like genetic differences between people. It's a very small portion of DNA, and that small portion of DNA does not matter. But that's a very separate discussion. I'd want to move to.
Let him respond. Let him
I mean,
respond to that first.
There's
Let him
already
respond
2
to that.
points on the list. So on this most recent point, you're absolutely wrong. 23andMe provides a complete scan of windows of the genome that are so detailed that you can actually not know if only your chromosome 2 has been inherited from Africa or Europe.
You got to mute that mic, Panini.
You can know if a subset of the chromosome 2 has been coming from Europe or Africa. So it's absolutely false to claim that it only does analysis of mitochondria and paternal genomes. They do that too. But here's where the fallacy lies in everything that you seem to say tonight. You seem to say that more detail is not interesting. 23andMe gives me the paternal line, gives me the maternal line, and on top of it, they give me the entire line of all of my genes. Well, all of my sections of chromosomes. So this gives me access not only to the fact, for example, that I know that my genetic ancestors on the father sides have been traveling much more extensively through the space that now would constitute Russia and toward Western Europe, whereas my female ancestors, they were all in a line that went much more straight toward Western Europe without making a contour toward Russia. This is the kind of information you can extract from a paternal and maternal genome. Yes, it is giving information about haplogroups, but the genes that are part of the rest of the genome are equally analyzed by 23andMe, and it gives me the proportion of how much European, African, and Native American gene I may have. It turns out in my case, I'm 100% white, 100% European, 0% African, 0% Indian, 0% Native American, 0% even Jew. This is just how it turns out. Now, coming back to your earlier point, when do we distinguish, and is there enough difference in humanity to declare a separate category? My question, I would try to bring you on the domain of physics here. If we were doing physics, what would be the minimum point of distinction that we would care about? Well, there wouldn't be a point at which we stop caring about. In fact, it's more interesting as the differences get finer. And so if we were doing physics, you couldn't possibly come here and do a debate and claim there is a certain level of size at which we stop caring about stuff. In fact, the minimal level of size at which you can observe a phenomenon should be the minimal threshold for science to be declared valid. So the minimal threshold for the concept of race to be declared valid is that a single difference can be identified between populations. Now, you then claim that it is a continuum and therefore races is not a fair concept. It is the continuum fallacy that you're performing there. First, it is not even the case that if it was a perfect continuum, we wouldn't have a concept of race. There can be continuum between things, and these things can still be different. For example, if I was to start to build morphologic cars that are essentially progressive morphologies between cars and pickup trucks, between the two, you would have a continuum of various bizarre-looking cars and bizarre-looking pickup trucks. That wouldn't have changed in any way the fact that cars exist and pickup trucks exist. The continuum fallacy is the conception that extremes stop existing when the middle ground is possible. That being said, I would say that Panini tonight, despite this being a fallacy, misrepresents the state of the differences between genetic populations, and we can see it in studies like that of Rosenberg, who's been doing clustering analysis, and he's been taking African populations, European populations, Indian and other Middle Eastern populations, Asian populations, East Asian, and then Native American populations. And what he did is he gave the genes of these populations to a computer, and he asked the computer, just from the genes, would you detect borders between these groups? Would you detect that one person belongs to this group and one other person belongs to that other group. And what we can find is that the computer has appropriately labeled in orange here all of the groups that just turned out to be tribes of Africa. And it's properly labeled mostly in blue, the Europeans, and properly labeled mostly in red, but with a little mix of blue, the populations between India and Europe. So clearly the clustering algorithms tell us that we're not deluded when we see these differences. Humanity is not spread onto a perfect continuum. There were massive geographic barriers that were keeping people from different places to reproduce together. And still, as of today, despite the cosmopolitan nature of our modern world, people still choose to have sex within their race at a higher frequency than they do across races. And so even without the geographical boundary, the clustering algorithm will continue to reflect the decisions of humanity, which is mostly to be interested at reproducing with your own kin.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, is that all the arguments you want to make? Because you made a lot of arguments there. I just want to address it one by one just to make sure that
that's it for your 2 points. But if you have further points, then you may have further responses.
Awesome. So I specifically want to talk about the idea of a single difference between a group and another group constitutes an interesting, I guess, scientific inquiry. Now, might be interesting, but it's not important. That's the thing, right? When we're looking at biology, especially the ideas of classification, we're looking at the field of taxonomy. So essentially, what we're trying to determine here is whether there is a significant taxonomical distinction between races, right? A single difference between groups is not enough to determine that. There is a difference between me and you. There's a difference between Andrew and Pedro. There's a difference between one human and any other human on the planet. Should we make a separate category for every single human on the planet because there were single differences between every single human? That doesn't make any sense, and that would be incredibly complicated for no reason. The distinctions that we make within taxonomy, the distinctions that we make within biology must be important differences. The differences must constitute some kind of importance in order to even be considered. Now, I want to make a particular statement about this continuum fallacy that you're accusing me of. The continuum fallacy is a fallacy where someone essentially outlines a continuum, but doesn't basically, I guess, acknowledge distinctions between people on different parts of that continuum. I stated at the beginning of this conversation that I agree human variation exists. If you take someone from Africa and you compare them to someone from Europe, they're going to be different genetically. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that that diversity exists along a spectrum. And I want to bring it back to the example that you talked about specifically with cars and trucks. Let's imagine that there is a vehicle spectrum, and we have on one end a car and on the other end a truck. And there are different types of cars, of course. You got like sedans. You could easily like put a sedan in the car category, and then you got like pickup trucks or semi-trucks. You could put that easily in the truck category. But where would you put minivans? Are minivans cars, or are they trucks? Or are they somewhere in the middle, right? We acknowledge there's differences between these things, but there is a continuum here. All of the distinctions that we make between cars and trucks and vans, they're all arbitrary. There is a huge continuum between the small cars and the large cars, and the only reason we call the different cars different things is because it's useful to us, right? It's useful to us to make categories of things. That's normally, you know, recognized in most things. I think I can give a good example of this. You were talking about physics. A good example of this is like color, right? A lot of us might think that, you know, colors definitely exist, right? But an interesting thing is that if you go to different cultures, I think in Japan, for example, and you show them the colors green and blue, they think then they're the same color. They don't have a distinction between the color green and the color blue. And the reason that is because color exists along a spectrum, right? The different frequencies of light create different colors, and the different wavelengths of light create different colors. And the distinctions between those colors are largely societal. We decide where red turns into orange and where orange turns into yellow, the same way that we decide where white turns into brown and brown turns into black. Right? That is our societal distinction that creates those differences between people. The fact that there might be one difference between one person and another person does not justify any of those racial categories that we are upholding in this debate. To respond to this attack on my biological validity as of now with the Rosenberg study, I'd actually like to read you a paragraph from Rosenberg's or from a basic statement by Rosenberg. And basically, he said that no samples were included from the regions between the boundaries. So two boundaries that the Rosenberg study found, for example, was the Sahara Desert and the Himalayas, right? That makes sense. The Sahara Desert is a geographical boundary between the lower parts of Africa and pretty much the rest of the world, and the Himalayas divide South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, from the rest of Asia. The problem is, when you sample from people in those areas, in the Sahara Desert, the Northern Africans, the Bedouins that live inside of Northern Africa, and when you sample from the native mountain people inside of Tibet and the regions around the Himalayas, those discontinuities disappear. And he even acknowledges this. He says that those discontinuities are largely artifacts of poor sampling. And there have been further studies, including Tishkoff et al. 2009, which found no genetic discontinuity between the Saharan Desert and the Sahel. Instead, a genetic continuum runs across Northern Africa into Mali. I don't have a study for the Himalayas, but I'm pretty sure that would exist for that region as well, considering that there are people living inside of the Himalayas and people that exist in those regions, which would create a genetic continuity between all the people in the world. These distinctions based on these geographical breaks between places don't actually exist. It's only an artifact of poor sampling.